of the virtual NALEO 37th Annual Conference. Now, I apologize, you probably are not seeing me because there are some technical difficulties, but we're going to power through this as we have this conversation about Latinos and the 2020 election. I'm really pleased to moderate the second live session here at the largest gathering of Latino elected and appointed officials and their supporters in the country. This session is called the 30 million voter question. Will Latinos flex their electoral muscle in 2020? First, join me in thanking and recognizing our hosts for this live plenary discussion, Comcast, NBC, Universal, Telemundo. I also want to thank each of you for tuning into this discussion and joining our panelists. Now, there's a chat function on your console. We encourage you to comment and engage with each other throughout the discussion. Also be active on social media using the hashtag #NALEOVirtual. And for those of you who engage in social media in this session, we're going to have a raffle. There are two of our panelists are authors with books that they will be discussing. And if you participate in the social media, you'll be entered in a raffle to win one of their books. It's a friendly reminder about the NALEO standard. You've heard it from our other presenters. We hold that in very high esteem at NALEO, and thank you for recognizing it. And now let's talk about this election. So this election feels like it's the most important election in our lifetimes, and I have always hated that characterization of any election because I firmly believe that every single election is important. But I think all of us recognize that there is a unique aspect of the election in 2020 and everything that is happening this year. Now today, we are releasing two NALEO Educational Fund electoral publications. The first is our projections of the Latino vote for November. We have a slide up, and I'm hoping that you can see it. There's a chart where we estimate that more than 30 million Latinos will be eligible to vote in November. And by that, we mean 30 million Latinos who are of voting age and are U.S. citizens. There's a little bit of discrepancy about the actual number. The Pew Research Center, you may have seen their numbers, puts the number of eligible Latinos at 32 million. Bottom line, Latinos are going to be the second largest eligible segment of the electorate in 2020. And how many will vote? Well, we at NALEO Educational Fund estimate that more than 14.6 million Latino voters are expected to turn out. Now that's a 15% increase from the election of 2016, 114% increase since the 2000 election. Know that our projections are based on Latino voter turnout trends for the past election cycles and reflect the steady growth of the Latino vote. And we'll go on to the next slide. No, stay on this slide. As the slide shows, many states are expected to see record turnout numbers, with increases for some states ranging from 10% to as much as 23%. Let's go on to the next slide. In this slide, we see one gubernatorial race that would be particularly competitive in this election cycle. It's the gubernatorial race for North Carolina, where incumbent Democrat Roy Cooper is running for his second and final term and is being challenged by Republican Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest. Now, the margin of victory in the last election was 0.2%. Keep in mind that in this election, Latinos will comprise 3.3% of the state's registered voters. There also are going to be a number of Senate races where Latinos could be decisive. We can go to the next slide. Here we're seeing states, including Arizona, that will have a particularly competitive state between Republican Martha McSally, which was appointed to her seat, who is being challenged by astronaut Mark Kelly. Latinos are 19% of the registered voters, and about 600,000 of them are expected to vote come November. In Colorado, incumbent Republican Senator Roy Gardner, who ousted Democrat Mark Udall in a tight race, is up for re-election, and former Governor John Hickenlooper, who ran for president and joined us last year in Miami as a candidate, is currently in the lead. So we'll see what happens in this race where Latinos comprise 10% of Colorado's registered voters and the turnout estimated at about 280,000. Georgia's an interesting state. There are 2 Senate seats up on the ballot. One where incumbent Senator David Perdue is being challenged by John Ossoff. And then there is the 2nd Senate seat where a large field is running together, both Democrats and Republicans, for the seat where Kelly Hoffler was appointed to this seat. If no candidate gets 50% or more, there will be a runoff in January. So these are expected to be very competitive races in a state where Latinos comprise 4% of the state's registered voters. Other states to watch, of course, is always Texas, where Senator John Cornyn is being challenged by Air Force veteran M.G. Edgar. Here, Latinos are 26% of registered voters, and well over 2 million Latinos are expected to vote. And North Carolina also will have a competitive race between Tom Tillis and Kay Hagan. But our projections, though, are tempered by what is happening today. And this goes to the second publication, which we are releasing today, which is our 2020 version of the report called Latino Voters at Risk, where we summarize all of the factors that may affect Latino turnout in 2020, not the least of which is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Latino voting and registration. COVID-19 is also having an impact on trends in naturalization and the ability to process legal permanent residents who are seeking to become U.S. citizens. We're following very closely to the extent to which candidates and political parties and nonprofit organizations are able to mobilize the Latino vote. You know, historically, there has always been a focus just on the battleground states. And those states where everybody assumes the outcome is predetermined because they're solid blue or solid red state get ignored. Well, 56% of Latino registered voters have lived in those kinds of states of California, New York, Texas, and Arizona. But now indications are that a couple of those states at least are in play, including Arizona and Texas. So we'll be monitoring very closely to see to the extent that political parties and campaigns will actually invest in turning out the Latino vote from both political parties. Both of these publications are available in the Sessions Handout tab on your view screen now and in the NALEO Conference Resource Center. So now let's talk a little bit about the 2020 elections, which a star panel of speakers that we have asked to join us for this conversation. I'm going to briefly introduce some. Their bios are also available on one of the tabs. We're going to be joined first by Lori Montenegro. She's the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for Noticias Telemundo. She will be followed by Stephanie Valencia, co-founder and president of Equus Research and a great friend of NALEO Educational Fund. I'm sure she'll share a little bit of our history together. Then we'll be joined by Dr. Geraldo Cadava. He's the author of The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity, from Nixon to Trump. He's an associate professor at Northwestern University. And then rounding up the panel is our good friend Chuck Rocha, president and founder of Solidarity Strategies and author of B.O. Bernie, the inside story of how Bernie Sanders brought Latinos into the political revolution. So let's start with Lori. Lori, we understand that Telemundo has some new data as well on Latinos going into this election with a particular focus on young Latino voters. Good to see you, Lori. You can't see me, but I see you. Hola.
Hola, Arturo. I hope you guys can hear me. Señor Rocha, Gerardo, Stephanie, it's a pleasure to be on the panel with you. I hope you can hear me. If you don't, yell. So just before we get started a little bit and diving into this really important discussion, which is the 2020 elections, really important. Telemundo launched earlier this year a company-wide initiative called Decisión 2020, Decision 2020, and it's going to run through the entire election cycle. It's a multi-platform initiative, and it also has a civic engagement initiative to help inform and engage our viewers during this year's election. The multi-layered effort includes extensive news coverage about the 2020 vote and we've actually added some extra newscasts at Telemundo, which will really help us reach a broader audience. The initiative is basically a manifestation of the company's longstanding commitment to provide lots of news to the Latino community, and that it be objective and have them make informed decisions. It also includes a focus on civic engagement, including nonpartisan voter registration, and we know how important that is in our community. And, you know, the registration drives, elections, polls, and surveys, and all those kinds of things that we know are important during this kind of a cycle. So today I'd like to share some initial findings from a survey of young Latino voters, like Arturo mentioned. We've recently conducted in partnership with BuzzFeed News. And the purpose of the survey is really to understand the core values and beliefs of young Latino voters that I personally believe are really going to be driving this election. We see them out there. We see them out there marching. They have gotten really involved in different movements. And so we wanted to kind of understand what are they thinking? Where are they going to? And so I believe I have some slides, and I hopefully the first one will come up. These initial findings basically take us, like I said, to delve deeper, you know, into the key issues that are motivating them. We did the survey back in June. It was online. We interviewed about 1,300 registered voters. Half of them were Hispanic, the other half non-Hispanic, and the ages between 18 and 34. So here we take a look in this first slide at young Latino voter preferences. And if the presidential election was held tomorrow, according to the survey, 60% of young Latinos would vote for Biden and 19% for Trump. Now, interesting that is not in this slide is that, and it's worth pointing out, I would say, is that of the two 2020 presidential candidates, 37% of young Latinos said they personally identify with Joe Biden, and 17% said they personally identify with President Trump. So as we move on to the next slide, this focuses on how young Latinos describe their party affiliation. About 50% of young Hispanic voters describe themselves as Democrats, 13% Republican, and 37%, and this is what I found really, really interesting, describe themselves as independent, undecided, or affiliated with a minor party. I would dare tell you that this is really important to both Republican and Democratic Party. This, I think, shows us that these young people are not following their parents. They're independent thinkers. They know what they want, and they're going to make candidates in both parties really work to get their vote. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And in our final slide, we look at who young Latinos consider to be political figures who have shown up for Latinos. So when asked to name a political figure who goes out of his or her way to support the community, 1/3, 33%, could not name anyone. But among those who did name a figure that supports Hispanics, the top people mentioned were Bernie Sanders, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and Joe Biden, who were all mentioned by 6% of the young Latinos that were surveyed. So it appears that young Latinos are looking for candidates that they consider allies to their community, allies, and them being able to accomplish their dreams and the goals that they have moving forward. So Arturo, these are some of the numbers. I'm going to turn it back to you and look forward to the discussion and learning from our experts on the panel.
Thank you, Lori. That's really interesting data, especially on the partisan affiliation of young Latino voters. What we want to get to is the issue as well about Latino voter enthusiasm and what are the nuances that are happening in this particular election. And so I'm going to ask Stephanie Valencia from Equis Labs Research if she could share with us some of the information and data that she's been collecting on going a little bit deeper dive into the Latino vote. Stephanie?
Great. Thanks, Arturo, and thanks everyone for joining today. I don't know if I want to admit this to start, but my first NALEO conference was now 18 years ago when I was a NALEO intern in 2002. So here we are in 2020. Never thought I would still be here. But thank you for inviting me. I co-founded ECIS Research and ECIS Labs with the goal of creating a better understanding of the Latino electorate and investing in new approaches to reach and engage them. And so the research that you are going to see and the numbers that you're going to see today very much aligned with what Lori just outlined, and also the numbers and analysis that Arturo kicked us off with, but is based on 35,000 interviews that we have done over the last year in 11 different states. We're about to go into another big round of polling here in the next couple of weeks, but this is the kind of top level analysis that you will see me walk through today is based on that depth and longitudinal look at the electorate. So let's first talk about what the opportunity is here in 2020. If we can go to the next slide. This next slide really represents some of the numbers that Arturo walked through earlier today, which is the opportunity of the Latino vote in just a slightly different way, which is looking at 4 different states and looking at what the Trump-Clinton margin was, what the share of the Latino vote is in terms of eligible and unregistered populations, registered non-voters, and then Latinos who voted third party, just so that we could get a sense of what opportunity exists to reach and engage either unregistered, and eligible, or those who are voting for a third party. And as you can see, in places like Arizona, where that number exceeds 645,000 and the margin of victory was only 91,000 in 2016. And then the very painful places of Michigan and Wisconsin, where, in 2016, the margin of victory was 10 or 20,000. And we see the numbers and opportunity to reach and engage Latino voters. Next slide. When we look at all 10 or 11 states that we have been polling in, and you kind of look at this breakdown of who are the likely voters, which is the blue band in 2020, who are showing up regularly every single election cycle, who are the registered non-voters, which is the green band, which is really important for us to think about, because these are the folks who took the step of registering to vote, in 2018, 2016, 2014, but aren't voting regularly. And so there's a huge opportunity to reach and engage those folks who are already registered to vote. And then we have the eligible and unregistered population, which in a normal year would be, there's so much opportunity, and this is where the growth of our community and the electorate is really being driven from. But given in the world that we are with COVID, where site-based voter registration is a lot more challenging, we have to look at new approaches to registering them online, but then also looking at that green band of people who are already registered and eligible. Next slide. When we look at the trends over time and see what are the biggest factors that really separate and distinguish the Latino community and the Latino electorate. And one of the most essential ones, it's not college versus non-college educated as it is in the kind of broader electorate. Really, it's this gender divide that we have seen in the Latino electorate, this difference between where Latino women are and where Latino men are. And even though we've seen some kind of movement away from Trump among men over the last several months, the depth of anti-Trumpness that exists among Latino women is one that is really to not be ignored. We also see religion as a huge dividing factor in the electorate as well. Next slide. But when we look at gender with women specifically, it's really important to note that Latino women actually turn out less than white and Black women. And this is a really important thing for us to understand the why that is. And as we have not done this research ourselves, but our partners over at Topos Research have started to study why do Latina non-voters not turn out in the election. And one of the major reasons cited is, my vote may not matter, but more importantly, they don't want to mess up. And so we have to provide very basic information about the ballot, who is on the ballot, how to vote, especially in a more complicated environment like this, really creating a clear lane and understanding and directions of how they should be thinking about participation, and making very clear you do not need a PhD in political science to vote. Next slide. One other category that's really important for us to consider as we look at the Latino electorate, and this is very similar to what Lori was just alluding to with regard to the independent nature of younger voters, is we have identified this category of what we're calling ambivalent voters. These are not apathetic voters. These aren't voters who say, oh, I just don't care about the system. These are people who are just like not really in either camp. Like they're kind of in the middle, they're unsure. And so there's a huge swath of voters. They're not necessarily undecided or not persuadable voters, or persuadable voters in the traditional sense that we look at those on campaigns, because they're probably likely to be against Donald Trump. But the reality of the matter is that they really aren't committed to either side and don't feel compelled to either side. Next slide. So let's take a quick look at the state of the race if we go to the next slide. This is from some recent polling in May. We're about to come back out with some fresh polling at the end of this month. But as you can see, where we see Biden versus Trump versus undecided, and where Hillary won Nevada by less than she lost Arizona. I think she won Nevada by 16,000 votes or something very narrow, and Arizona was 91,000 votes was the margin of victory. So while many folks think this may be the year to turn Arizona blue, we can't do that at the expense of not looking at Nevada. Next slide. But the one thing we need to know about Joe Biden right now is that he is well known but not sharply defined in the Latino community. In some recent focus groups that we've done and over the course of our polling, people know who he is. They know he was Barack Obama's vice president for 8 years, but they can't necessarily say what they agree with him on or pin a particular position or policy priority on him. And so there's a lot of room to be defining who Joe Biden is with this community. And you've started to see some of that work coming from the campaign. Next slide. We will dig in lastly, just super quickly, because I know Chuck is going to be the next speaker. We've done this roadshow plenty of times before, but really admire the work of the Sanders campaign, who made major inroads in the Latino community. As I like to remind people, Bernie Sanders did not win the Latino vote in 2016 in the primary against Hillary Clinton, but he invested serious time. His positions really aligned and tapped into some of the challenges that the Latino community was really feeling and experiencing, those being free community college, immigration, and healthcare. And what we saw from the campaign was where dedicated resources met a strong message with a committed candidate really yielded results. And we saw that especially in a place like Nevada. We did a comparison between Nevada and Colorado, where, as Chuck will probably talk about, they really emphasized Nevada. There was a little less emphasis on Colorado, and you actually saw that bear out in the numbers, which is a lesson to all candidates who are wishing to engage and reach Latino voters, is that where you actually put your money where your mouth is, you can actually reach and engage this electorate. Next slide. And it worked. As we can see, Sanders, as you take the case study of Arizona, and we talk about that ambivalent cohort where there are those kind of unsure, like not committed to either side, generally voters, that ambivalent cohort, Bernie Sanders was the only one able to actually break through with that cohort. He was also able to break through with the mobilization cohort, which is very strong Democrats. But I think that's just a really important thing to point out, is that, he was able to break through there. Next slide, last slide. And when we look at who those Sanders supporters were, because we can't ignore this as folks think about who they're going to be engaging for the next 88 days, it was largely younger people, which we know. But surprisingly, despite the myth that Bernie's coalition was made up of Bernie bros, among Latinos, it was actually women and Latinas. And so that is, again, the role that Latinas can play in being the decision makers and the deciders this election cycle. So I think with that, I'm tossing it to Chuck, or back to Arturo.
Terrific. Thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to actually ask Lori to come back up. Oh, look at, yeah, there I am. To come back up and to react a little bit to Stephanie's data, and how do you think it compared to what your poll with Telemundo found about young Latino voters? Lori, you're talking, but we can't hear you. So we're going to see if, yeah, you're Your connection may be bad, so why don't you hold that thought, and we're going to call on Geraldo Cadava from Northwestern University, and he's going to give us a perspective about the history of Latinos within the Republican Party and what are the odds now of Latinos continuing the kind of support that they have shown for President Trump that we saw in 2016, in 2020. Some interesting perspectives here from Dr. Cadava.
Hi, thank you for having me, and it's great to be here. I hope my internet connection holds out for the next couple of minutes here. And thank you for hosting this. This is a great panel. So my perspective on this topic is as a scholar who has written of Hispanic Republicans since the mid-20th century. And I wrote this book for a few different reasons. First, my grandfather, who's now in his mid-90s, is a Hispanic Republican and has voted for Republican presidential candidates since the 1980 election when he was a Reagan Democrat. And I've talked with him about Latino politics basically since the time that I was a kid. And I'm sure that this book in many ways is still part of my ongoing conversation with him, even though we don't talk about politics anymore. But more importantly and broadly, I think I wrote this book because I believe that it's important to take Latinas and Latinos and Hispanic Republicans in particular seriously as political actors with serious political ideas. And I think that for too long, they've been taken for granted by both parties. And I think in order to understand who Latinos are as a whole, it's important to understand both sides of the political equation. And I also just believe that it's important to understand and grasp the ideas of people that you don't necessarily agree with. Those are some reasons that I wanted to write the book. And let me tell you about some of my findings, which I think have implications for the 2020 election that we can unpack during our conversation. I think the first is that a significant minority of Hispanic voters has voted for Republican presidents since the early 1970s. Their support for Republicans at the state level came even earlier and was often even greater than their support for Republicans nationally. Second, their support for Republicans has remained remarkably steady over the decades, with some notable exceptions, even as the Republican Party has shifted to the right on immigration and border control. I think that their steady support has to do with two things. First, I think Hispanic Republicans, like all Latinos, say that they care about more issues than just immigration, including jobs, education, healthcare, and that there are Republican positions on each of these issues that they align with. I do think it's important to note that this, of course, has always been true. It's always been the case that Latino voters care about more than just a single issue. But I think that Hispanic Republicans have had to pronounce that increasingly since the 1990s as a justification for their continued support for Republican candidates since the 1990s because of the Republican Party's turn. I also believe, and this is the second reason I think that their support has remained steady, is that over a long period of time, Hispanic Republicans have become loyal Republicans, and they won't switch their party allegiance easily, even if they don't love the candidate at the top of the ticket. Finally, I think many observers of politics have assumed that Hispanic conservatism is about Cubans and Catholicism. These were the two things that I got over and over as I was writing the book. When I said I was writing this book, the first reaction people had was, you must be talking about Cubans and Catholics. And I would say that this is an important part of the story, but it's hardly the whole story. I think that Hispanic conservatism is much broader and deeper than those two issues alone. And I think we miss a bigger picture if we try to put the topic in that box. So I'm going to end here. I'd be happy to expand on all of these points in our discussion. And if I don't get to it then I'm happy to continue engaging over Twitter or email or phone or however it is people communicate these days. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cadava. Don't leave because I have a question for you. I wonder if you could react to some of the data that Lori presented, where she showed a larger share of Latino youth voting for Trump than other demographic and racial groups, except for, I think, whites, if I recall her data correctly. How do you think that reflects in the attitudes and the issues that you're looking at right now?
I think it's super interesting. I mean, I think that it does point to the fact that there will, again, this election be a significant minority of Latino voters who support the Republican candidate. I think I was also struck by a lot of the data where the number of independents is rising, or the percentage of independents or percentage of Latinos, including youth who identify as independents, is rising. And I'd be very curious to know, once you dig a little bit underneath what independent means to Latino youth, if they would lean one way or the other. I mean, I'm still thinking about recent Pew Hispanic research polls finding that some 32% of Latinos either today, if the election were held today,
Okay, looks like we just lost your audio there for.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I'm wondering.
Okay, now you're back.
Yeah, now I'm in the phone. I'm sorry about the internet connection, guys. Since the event is sponsored by Comcast, maybe they could help me out real quick. Yeah, I would be curious to know what's behind the rising percentage of independents and whether those independents are leaning one way or the other. But I think as a whole, I think the minority of Latinos will vote for Republicans, and it's important.
We lost your audio a little bit, but I do have another question. We saw a situation in California emerge in the 1990s with Proposition 187, and many observers saw that or considered that as a reason why the Latino electorate in California moved so strongly towards the Democratic Party. Is there a national movement in that, with that phenomenon that you see? Do the data bear it out, or do you really see a solid Republican vote among the Latino electorate, no matter who the candidate is?
These are terrific questions. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, one thing that's always struck me about the California results since 1990 is that even, for decades after Proposition 187, it still remains true that 23 or 24% of Latinos, even in California, continue to vote for Republican candidates. This is decades after Proposition 187, and I think it's been reported that this year there will be some 8 million eligible Latino voters in California. So that means as many as 2 million Latinos in the state of California will vote for Donald Trump, which, if you kind of game it out by the math, that's more than more Latino voters will vote for Donald Trump in California than even in a place like Florida, just based on the size of the Latino vote, or could vote for Donald Trump in California, depending on turnout. So, even in a place like California, there has been a significant minority. I think, California is not a swing state, so it doesn't get a lot of attention, and California isn't going to determine the election. I think it's going to be, fought out as Lori and Stephanie have pointed out, in swing states like Arizona and Florida. And there, the margins are what are really important. And I think the goal of the Trump campaign isn't so much to expand support among Hispanics in those places, but just to solidify the support that they've already won in earlier elections. So, and in elections where margins are so thin, 10,000 votes was the margin that Rick Scott beat Bill Nelson by, and 100,000 votes was the margin that Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton by. I think those small efforts to solidify support could make a difference.
Right, and so California is not a swing state, and much to my personal frustration, The 4 million Latinos who we expect to vote here often get ignored by campaigns and by political candidates. But we saw a departure from that in the Bernie Sanders campaign. And so I'm going to bring up Chuck Rocha now to talk about the strategies that the Sanders campaign used that really broke the mold in terms of figuring out how to reach and engage Latino voters in ways that other campaigns haven't done. Chuck, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, my friend Arturo. Thank you to Stephanie and Laura and Gerardo and everybody here and all of you that are watching at home. And thank you for being here. You know, NALEO's always had a special place in my heart because they've just advocated for the community. You know, the one negative about NALEO is that they just don't get enough money. People should give more money to NALEO because they are underfunded and they do some of the best work out there with limited resources. And Arturo and Stephanie, thank you for your kind words about our work with Bernie Sanders. What I did was groundbreaking. What my team did, what 200 Latinos that worked on the campaign did, was what most of you in your gut always knew we needed to do, which was just a few things. A, we hired Latinos to do the work. We had Latino consultants and Latino staffs, Latinos in every department, and Latinos actually running the presidential campaign. And in my book, T.O. Bernie, and you can go to toberniebook.com to buy that, lays out open source exactly what we did state by state. And people have said, why would you do that, Chuck? Why won't you get your consultant? People could hire you. Because I never again wanted to hear that Latinos don't vote. And I can say, if you will read my book, you can see exactly, to Stephanie's point, how we did that. And I lay it out budget line by budget line, what apparatus we use to talk to the voters. But the key to that is we talk to them. The key to that is we talk to them early. The key to that is we talk to them early with Latinos, by Latinos, with a culturally competent campaign. You know, the things that Lori talked about, the things that Stephanie talked about, the great research that's out there, the great modeling, the great analytics on issues and where young Latinos are and where the persuadable universes are, really don't matter at all if you don't spend any money to go talk to them. Now, if you do spend some money to go talk to them, you should do exactly what Lori and Stephanie said to do and take both of their informations, and then you can equate it to that voter. Our problem, Latinos, whether you're Democrat, Independent, Republican, is nobody spends money to talk to us. I've been doing this for 31 years. I've worked on over 500 campaigns. I ran Bernie Sanders' presidential race. I worked on 35 congressional races last cycle. I've done this a long time. That don't make me good. It means I've just seen people mess up a lot. And I'm here to tell you, as the practitioner on this panel, and a lot of your friends, I have never missed a NALEO conference since I've started my firm. And it's one of the things I look forward to every day, because there's where you see the next generation of Latinos actually working on the ground. And that's how you all get elected. You go to the community, you engage the community, you knock on their door, you send them a phone call, you send them a text, you maybe run a TV commercial or a radio ad, you run digital ads, right? Well, not all campaigns do that. What the book that I wrote lays out, if you treat a Latino voter as as big a priority as most campaigns prioritize a suburban swing voter, that elusive voter that voted for Barack Obama and then for Donald Trump. Ooh, that makes everybody get all warm and fuzzy because they got to figure out the strategic relationship to turn that person out. I proved this with Bernie Sanders, that dollar goes way farther if you invest in a younger Latino infrequent voter or a younger newly registered Latino voter. They will show up at a much higher rate than that suburban woman that you think you're going to get, that they called soccer mom, or they called this, or that steel worker in Ohio. You know, because I've been in those campaign rooms for generations where they've said, you know, we're out of money now. It's October. We just can't really fund that Latino program. We're going to double down on some more Philadelphia TV targeted those suburban white voters. Well, I turned that on its head, to Arturo's point. In California, the Bernie Sanders campaign, because I was there driving the budget, spent over $3 million in just 6 weeks to talk to Latinos, not counting 127 staff on the ground, 72 of those being Latinos. Now, talking about doing an NPP program, talking to those young Latinos that Lori was talking about that are registered as non-party preference, telling them that they had to go and request a presidential ballot because they actually wouldn't even get a ballot in the mail if they were signed up for permanent absentee balloting in California for the presidential race. So we spent another $1 million educating those young Latinos. The average age of the Latino voter in America is 27. The average age of a white voter in America is almost 38. There's just a difference in the divide in our culture of understanding our culture, understanding the nuances of our community. But the bottom line is if you will come to our community and meet us where we're at and spend money to show that we are a priority, set up your offices there, hire people from there, do your TV ads, the digital ads, tell the community, to Stephanie's point, what you're going to do for us. Bernie Sanders is a 78-year-old Jewish man from Burlington, Vermont. It ain't who you think about when you think of a brown savior who's going to win 73% of the vote in Nevada. But because we started 7 months early and said Bernie Sanders' father came here from another country, he couldn't speak English and he had no money. So we opened up the door to say, hey, we understand where you come from and at least where your family comes from. And then we could go on to the next conversation and say, and here's what we think about healthcare. And here's what we think about minimum wage. And here's what we think about the Green New Deal. But we didn't do that in the last 10 days. We did that month and week and week. We sent 18 pieces of mail to Latinos in Nevada. Every week they got a different piece of mail talking about how Bernie Sanders was going to make their life better. And that's the reason we dominated.
So, Chuck,
and I will turn it back to you and let you have all the time to ask any questions you may have.
Yeah, just curious on that. What percent of the overall Bernie budget then was devoted to Latino outreach?
If you put in the staff and you put in the literature that we were handing out on the ground, I've estimated we spent just short of $19 million. And that's just in 4 states. Well, 5 states, really. So if you think about that, that's a huge investment. I spent almost $3 million in Nevada. So Arturo, let me recap. Iowa, we spent money. Nevada, we spent money. South Carolina, we spent money. California, we spent money. Texas, we spent money. Arizona, Colorado, and Illinois. So just in 8 states, I spent almost $20 million on Latino outreach.
Well, let me take it back to Lori and ask her for some reactions here. There's been a lot of conversation about young Latino voters. Lori, your data was specifically about them. How do you react to Chuck's analysis, Dr. Cadava's analysis, what Stephanie contributed?
So basically, they, everything that they are talking about, aligns with what we found in this study that is going to really delve in deeper to the key issues that are motivating the young Latino voters, and it's going to be coming out in the next few weeks. And it's going to be look a lot like what all 3 speakers have already addressed. And what I wanted to say, and Chuck has already alluded to this, probably saying it a lot more eloquently than I'm going to say it. But basically, what I think we are seeing in all these polls and all these surveys, and with the actions of the Latino voters, especially the young people, and what we're seeing them do when they're out there marching, and and they become so much more active in anything that has to do with civic engagement, is that moving forward, the political campaigns, the political strategists who advise these campaigns are just going to have to change the way they do things, Arturo. I think they've got to change their playbook. The Bernie Sanders campaign showed that, approaching the Latino community as you have been trying to do for the past 20, 30 years is just not going to work anymore. This is a new generation of voters who think totally different, who are much more daring, who are asking for much more from the candidate. They just don't want lip service. They want to see actions. These are people who are really doing research. That is what I'm seeing, and I think that is what all the 3 speakers are saying. There's a frustration out there amongst these young people, and that frustration is what I think is leading to them not committing to either party and saying now we're independent. Yes, it is. It's going to be interesting to see what do they mean by being independent, but I think what we're seeing is an example of the frustration that these young people are feeling with regards to access to education, their parents' health care, pensions moving forward, or their retirement. They're just much more educated, much more in tune, and they want people who are really going to not just pay them lip service, but they want to see them, representing them and putting into action when they get to the White House or they get to Congress, what exactly are you doing? So this is at all levels, and I think it's also at the local level. I think it's mayors, I think it's councilmen. It's just not
Absolutely.
at the federal level.
All these elections matter. And I have a curious question for Dr. Cadava in terms of a reaction to Chuck Rocha's presentation about the investment in a certain segment of the Latino electorate and being able to turn them out for their candidate. Would a Republican strategy also, do you think, yield the same kind of results? Well, we're not hearing
For
you,
Republicans,
Dr. Cadava, so
no.
I'm going to go over to Stephanie. Oh, there you are. Yeah, for a Republican.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. Yeah, for a Republican.
Is this better?
Yes.
Yes. Let me try to mute my computer. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, hang on. Hello? Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, if you mean yield results in the sense that 60%, 70% or 80% of Latinos will vote for a Republican candidate, absolutely not. That's not going to happen. But I don't know that that's even the goal. But one thing in response to what Mr. Rocha was saying that I totally agree with is that sustained effort and campaign investment is what's important. And I think even the best Republican campaigns have recognized that as well. I'm thinking about the Nixon campaign in the early 70s, where their outreach person, Stu Spencer, knew that going into East Los Angeles, setting up medical clinics, advising Mexican Americans in East Los Angeles on their immigration status, and showing up day in and day out, not just months before an election, they recognize that as important. And I do think that the spending of campaign money is a reflection of priorities. And I think that the longer a period of time that a candidate and their campaign invests in the Latino community, the kind of longer horizon they have in advance of an election, the better they can do. And I think that Chuck's outreach effort really demonstrated that. And I do think that in some senses, the Biden campaign is a little bit behind the eight ball right now and has to play catch up. I do think that the Trump campaign has launched its Latino campaign really for years. I mean, Trump has been speaking at the annual gatherings of the Latino Coalition. The campaign went down to Florida in May of 2019. Mike Pence has been giving speeches at evangelical churches in Orlando since January of 2020. So they have a longer runway, and the Biden campaign is going to have to play some catch up now.
Well, let me ask Stephanie on that point. Your data, Stephanie, showed that, if I recall correctly, Latino voters have heard of Biden, but they cannot define Biden. They really don't know him. Do you think there's a big risk here of the Biden campaign by having started late with courting the Latino vote? Anything they can learn from Chuck over there?
Yeah, I think a lot of what the Bernie campaign did, I think that the numbers that we saw are very troubling, right? Like in the sense that, he's well known but not sharply defined. And in order to increase motivation and excitement among Latino voters, they need to not just be anti-Trump, but vote for something. And so there continues to be a huge lane. You have seen an uptick in spending from the Biden campaign over the last few months. They've increased their digital and television buys. So they are starting to pick up that engagement. But, as much as I love Chuck, and the Bernie campaign was very lucky to have him, a lot of what they were able to do is replicable. And it just takes putting in the work. What I often say is that Democrats have gotten away with a very binary approach to doing Latino engagement for a very long time, where we treat Cubans one way and we treat everybody else the same. And we are in a moment and where the future of the Democratic Party and the progressive movement is going to depend on trying to actually understand who this electorate is. And it is going to take, we are a very diverse electorate. We obviously have some threads that tie us together and that create a community that are really important for us to tap into. But whether you're young or old or Afro-Latino or white passing or, any number of other markers, first generation immigrant or 10th generation immigrant, there are ways for us to communicate individually with different subgroups that is going to be very important for us to think about how we engage the community moving forward. And so there's a lot of lessons learned from the Bernie campaign. And unfortunately, I hope we don't have to learn any hard lessons this year with regard to the Latino vote. There's still plenty of time to make that up. But again, this is a problem that Democrats and progressives are going to have to contend with for the longer term.
And Arturo, what I find interesting,
Go ahead,
Arturo, and I want to just jump in here real quick, is I find it, and I'm just going to say it, I think it's, a shame. I think it's shameful that all these years later, Latinos are still not taken, I would say, they're seriously enough for a campaign to, from the get-go, go out there and talk to the Latino voter and reach out to them. I mean, what more needs to happen for them to invest money, as Chuck was saying and Stephanie's alluding to, and be consistent with that? I mean, I don't understand why, why is it taking so long for them to get it, for any candidate to get it? Latinos are here, they're here to stay, they pay, they contribute, and what does it take for you to pay attention to them?
Chuck, I bet you have an answer to that.
Oh my goodness, pick me. Okay, so a couple things. One is it's not just the money, and I want to make this point to everybody. Michael Bloomberg spent more money than we did, almost twice as much money as we did on Latino outreach. And woke white consultants are not going to save you. So if you hire a woke white consultant who's going to give you all the great strategy and translate your best English ad and Google translate it into Spanish and then run some generic mail out there with some Latino family on it, you're still not going to win. That's what I mean by hiring culturally competent people who understand your community, hopefully brown consultants. I can turn you on to lots of other ones if you don't like the way that I talk. But don't be hiring any more white folks to run your Latino program, no matter how woke they are. Let me put that there to begin with. And the other thing I will say is that the reason things don't change, Lori, and I've been doing this a long time, is the diversity ends where the money begins. You have an elite group of consultants, Democrat, Republicans, who have run these campaigns forever. And they've mainly been TV consultants because that's where 80% of all the spending goes. And that consultant has built a house down on the beach and got a fishing cottage upstate. Like, they don't want things to change because they got it pretty good. And because Latinos don't vote, they don't have to spend any time and money trying to figure us out. What Stephanie's been doing with her research crew is really thrown a light on lots of things. And then me starting Nuestro PAC and United We Dream and other people that are out there kind of pushing that. And then you have NALEO out there in the C3 lane saying, we can't even get the census done right. So now you're starting to see that big ship turn because these people in the street with all of this righteous anger are on the right side of history. And all of these old white consultants who've run the Democratic infrastructure forever have now started to retire. They've made place for my crazy Mexican redneck self to be able to work for Bernie Sanders and other people like Stephanie to have space. So it is changing. It's just not changing fast enough. But let me give credit. Things are starting to move, but we have to take money away from politics and look at who's actually the best to make it happen.
Okay, I want to turn to one last topic before we run out of time here. This is not an ordinary year by any measure. And our report, Latino Voters at Risk, talk about the effect that COVID-19 will have potentially on Latino voter enthusiasm, as well as the opportunities that Latinos will have to cast a ballot either by mail effectively and accurately, or to have safe and secure in-person voting where they will be comfortable going out to vote. I'm going to ask each of our panelists if they could react to how they see the COVID-19 circumstances playing out from where they sit. Lori, we'll start with you.
I would tell you that it's concerning. Our community has been hard hit, probably the hardest hit. I think that really only time is really going to tell how all of this is going to play out. It's going to take some heavy lifting with all the talk of this. a mail-in ballot? If it's not a mail-in ballot, is it absentee? Do they go? They stand in the line? I would tell you that it's concerning, but I also think that there are things that are happening in our country that are going to motivate our community to find a way to vote and to find a way to get their voice heard and accomplish that or gain that change that they're looking for to have a better life in this country and gain what they would like to, and do what they want to do, and for their families and so forth.
Stephanie.
I'll make three really quick points. The first one is, how COVID is being handled at the state level is a prism by which voters are going to participate in this election. So quickly in Nevada, as we polled people in Latino voters in Nevada, we saw that, the economy superseded concerns around healthcare and personal health and safety, whereas every other state we polled in, personal health and safety and testing was a primary concern. So places are going, especially now as the economy is shifting and we're in our, 5th month of quarantine, people are going to be viewing how to participate in the election by how this is affecting them in their pocketbooks and their families and their health. The second piece that's really important is the tactics that we are affected, right? Like voter registration. There's no more site-based voter registration, at least for the near future. So expanding the pie is going to mean doing online voter registration and finding new approaches to bring new people into the electorate. And again, going back to the first slide that I did, tapping into those already registered but non-voting Latinos who have taken the trouble to vote. And so how do we increase turnout from that subsegment of the electorate? Third, which we can't ignore, is the noise coming from the White House about moving the election date, or in the small signals of trying to show that maybe there will be an attempt to try to invalidate election results or try to create enough concern around the validity of the election that people will not want to participate or will distrust what the ultimate result is. And I think we need to understand a lot more about where Latino voters are with regard to that narrative. I think it's a very scary narrative for democracy and for our country, but one that we really need to better understand where Latino voters view that.
Dr. Gadava?
Let me just say one really quick thing in response to the last question about how it is that for so long parties have been able to ignore Latino voters. I don't think it's going to be possible to ignore us for much longer because we represent a growing slice of both the American population and the American electorate. I don't think it's right that we have been ignored for decades, but I do think that there's a certain bad logic, but logic nevertheless, that, say in the mid-20th century, Latinos represented 4% of the American electorate. Now that number is up to 10, 11, 12, 13, 14%, and it grows every time. So I think that, at 4% of the electorate, maybe it's easier to brush aside Latinos, even if it's not the right thing to do. But I think that will be harder and harder to do. In terms of the response to COVID, I do think that both the coronavirus and the Black Lives Matter protests
About the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, I was just saying that I think that those issues will pose me.
Hang on a second. That sounds like a mess. Can you guys hear me better now? Hello? Okay. So, yeah, I think that these issues have posed the greatest threat to Trump's campaign among Latinos, because the campaign going into 2020 was confident that they could rely on an economic argument, but that has gone away. And I think that they lost their footing for a while. But I do think that a couple of weeks ago, with the onslaught of Hispanic outreach events at the White House, they tried to shape the narrative again around situation and the moving national conversation around the coronavirus and racial reckoning will change how Latinos vote in November.
Turning out for this conversation. My apologies for the technical difficulties, but we powered through it as best we could. Please join me once again in thanking and recognizing our hosts for this live plenary discussion, Comcast, NBC, Universal Telemundo. I would like to invite you to enjoy the rest of the conference. Please view the various on-demand sessions available. There are a number of sessions that focus on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and different aspects of the lives of Latinos, and there is a session that specifically addresses carrying out the elections under the current circumstances. Please also visit our networking space where you can connect with other conference participants. Post on the Healing and Remembrance Wall. We have made a space available for those of you who have been affected by the tragedy of COVID-19, either a loved one or someone you know who may have perished from the virus or has been affected by it. If you'd like to share a thought about them, please visit our Healing and Remembrance Wall for that. Don't forget the marketplace, visit our sponsors, and also join in our service project. Those of you who received the swag box got some coloring pages. If you color those, post them online. NALEO Educational Fund will donate $5 to the two organizations that are benefiting from our service project this year. So please do that, and then we will see you again in a couple of hours for the virtual NALEO Happy Hour. It's a perfect opportunity to safely make those same face-to-face connections that you've come to expect at the NALEO conference. So come to the virtual happy hour with a cocktail. Join us again, and this will be at 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern. Finally, don't forget tomorrow, we have the second day of the NALEO Annual Conference. New content will be released in pre-recorded on-demand sessions, and then we'll have a live plenary with presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Vice President Joe Biden, who will be addressing the conference tomorrow at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. So thank you so much, and that concludes this second live session of the virtual NALEO 37th